Hello and welcome to this rapid response episode, The Human Cost of ICE Raids, Their Impact on the Community and Families. I'm Stacy Brustin. I direct the Immigration Law and Policy Initiative at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., and I also am a member of the American Bar Association Commission on Immigration.
Hi, everyone. My name is Luvia Quinones. I'm the Senior Director of Health Policy at the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, also known as ICIRR.
Today, we're going to be talking about the impact of the current administration's implementation of nationwide mass deportation of immigrants, and especially focusing on the impact in communities of the ICE enforcement that has been taking place over the last year. So we want to start by just discussing some of the policies that have been used to implement this mass deportation campaign. And really, the policy was stated initially by President Trump on the day he took office when he issued executive orders mandating that mass deportation begin. The orders were then implemented, and two of these orders, one called Protecting American People Against Invasion and the other Securing Our Borders, really laid the groundwork for mass arrest, mass deportation, mass detention, and mass deportation, with a stated goal, to deport approximately 11 million undocumented immigrants. And the White House set a target of arresting 3,000 immigrants per day. So with those marching orders, a number of policies needed to be either enacted or rescinded to carry out that order. And some of the most significant that really have had a very chilling effect, which we'll talk about in the community, is that the administration eliminated all enforcement priorities. So in the prior administration, and in many other administrations, the idea was that you wouldn't just indiscriminately enforce, ICE wouldn't indiscriminately enforce because of resource limitations and also humane considerations and consideration of people having lived for very long periods of time in the United States. So the focus was on specific priorities for enforcement: people who had criminal convictions, individuals who were known to be national security threats, individuals who had recently arrived, those with removal orders already issued. But there was no mass targeting of families or people wherever ICE could find them, and that changed. So there are no enforcement priorities. And related, the administration rescinded very important policies that protected sensitive locations from enforcement. So, and this had been in place in one way or another for almost 30 years. But this rescission meant that ICE could now enforce at schools, hospitals, medical clinics, places of worship. And so, again, this idea that anybody at any time could be picked up led to great fear, but also it meant that the numbers of those arrested could be increased exponentially. Also, policies about arresting individuals at ICE check-ins and in immigration court, which has caused tremendous fear, because all of those people who are going to check-ins, who are going to immigration court, are doing so pursuant to orders that they show up in court. So they're trying to do the right thing, and yet there have been lots of arrests at ICE check-ins and in immigration court. Another huge factor has been the increase in cooperation between ICE and local law enforcement and federal law enforcement. So there are agreements that have been entered, and there have been more than 520 agreements entered into in 35 states that have allowed local law enforcement to collaborate with federal ICE agents on immigration enforcement during routine patrols. And so this has stepped up ICE's capacity, the national from the top, from the National Guard being instituted in places like Washington, D.C., down to the local sheriff's office, helping to report individuals who may have been arrested for some minor infraction being reported to ICE for detention. There's been expanded information sharing so that agencies that had always promised, like the IRS, that, if you pay your taxes, we don't report you to immigration. Well, now all of those information prohibition on information sharing agreements have been removed so that this wall is gone and people can be more easily targeted. Um, and then one other big issue that has been fueling the mass deportation effort is this creation of new classes of undocumented individuals. And what I mean by that is that people who were formerly in a legal status, right? So they may have had temporary protected status. They may have had humanitarian parole. So they came in legally, or they received a temporary legal status. The administration has rescinded those. For example, TPS from Nicaragua, Honduras, Venezuela. And so that puts those who were in more of a legal status into an undocumented status, and they are then very vulnerable to deportation. So all of this is intended to do several things, to just increase the amount of people that are removed from the country, also to deter immigration into the country, and I think most significantly to encourage or what is so-called voluntary deportation, that people are so terrified, traumatized, living in such miserable conditions in detention that they decide to request deportation. And then I think one of the most disturbing elements is what's going to be happening down the road, the influx of funding that I know, Luvia, you wanted to mention.
Yes, thank you, Stacy. Yeah, one of the other, you could say, effects and now law that has impacted this greatly, in addition to everything you just mentioned, Stacy, and I know we don't have time to discuss everything that's been happening the last nine to 10 months, is all the funding that was allocated for purposes of immigration enforcement through HR 1, also known as the Big Beautiful Bill. Or other names that people may refer to. It's something that we as immigrant advocates did emphasize a lot, but did not get as much attention as we thought it would have. And what I mean about this is just the significant level of funding from what we know just in overall. So we're talking about 45 billion with the B. For detention capacity. We're talking about 29.9 billion for enforcement and removal operations. And we're talking about another 10 billion, again with the B, for border security over the next 5 years. So we're talking about very, very high funding allocations. And unfortunately, that is what's been leading to just not only enforcement increasing drastically in many of our cities, including right now here in Chicago, but across the country. And unfortunately, that's just what's leading not only the increased fear, anxiety, but also just the trauma that the community is facing as a result of all these agents now being dispersed everywhere. And I also wanted to touch a little bit about one of the other policies you mentioned, which is the rescission around sensitive locations. For those of you that may not be familiar, up until I believe it was March of this year when it got rescinded, there were certain locations where Immigration Custom Enforcement, ICE, were suggested not to be going and not to be enforcing immigration laws. And those include faith institutions, schools, hospitals, courthouses, just to name some. Unfortunately, that policy, that was a longstanding policy for a number of years, did get rescinded. And that's what we're seeing now, ICE going to various courts, including domestic violence courts. That's what's happened here in Illinois, going to hospitals, going to clinics, to either one, detain people or simply just being out there. We know that we've heard from pediatricians, nurses, and many other health providers just of what this means. So I wanted to highlight one story that was recently shared with a pediatrician that we work with, sharing how parents are so afraid to go to even hospitals that they're dropping off their children at the emergency room, and then they go pick them up once the child has been stabilized. As a mom of two, I cannot imagine ever having to do that. But those are the things that are happening as a result of not only the increase of immigration enforcement, but also, again, these policies being rescinded. That unfortunately now these children are being taken care of by these medical professionals that are complete strangers to them without their parent. So just wanted to highlight that as an example of just the impact of what this means, in addition to the fear and the anxiety.
And we're really feeling the impact here in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area as well. There are the D.C. Teachers Union just filed an amicus brief in a lawsuit that has been filed in federal district court in D.C. Talking about all of these impacts and the way in which these ICE raids and enforcement actions are taking place, where the ICE agents are often in unmarked cars, are in plain clothes, are wearing masks, have no identification, which is something that in our city, our police department, they have badges, they have body cameras, they have other ways that they can be identified and held accountable. And so this has really just changed the game here and caused tremendous fear, not only at these sensitive locations, but further rupturing trust in the police, so that not only are people not going to medical clinics, there are reports that the teachers union documented of dramatic decreases in school attendance, increase in traumatization of kids, both immigrants and non-immigrants, those whose um, families have been directly affected, or those kids who are friends with children. They don't know whether they're going to be in school the next day or not. And then also a fear of reporting crimes. And so just deciding that it's just not safe to do so. People in my neighborhood are terrified about going out to buy groceries. So we now have mutual aid programs going on, and this might be one very small sliver of a silver lining, which is that all of these impacts have often led to, and I've seen this in my neighborhood, tremendous community activism and community cohesion, but in trying to help folks. But people are not going to work, and that is not just undocumented individuals. This is documented folks who are afraid that somehow or another they're going to get caught up in the dragnet. And so we're seeing shortages in construction, in the food service industry, in home healthcare aides, because people are afraid that they will be arrested if they are out on the street. And similarly, we have a very large parish in our neighborhood, a church in our neighborhood that has a large immigrant population of congregants, and their Sunday Mass is down 500 people now because people are afraid to go to places of worship. And this is having a particular impact on communities of color, particularly in the Latino community, in many areas, which this profiling that's been going on has been facilitated by the Supreme Court's decision in the decision recently to basically allow for profiling in these situations. This was in Vasquez Perdomo versus Nome, where ICE, at least on a temporary basis, the case is still in litigation, but ICE has been allowed to use criteria such as the type of job people are working at, whether they speak Spanish and whether they speak English with an accent, apparent race or ethnicity. So the kinds of factors that have always been prohibited in policing are now being permitted, which is having an outsized impact, not just on immigrants, but on the Latino community as a whole, where I know most people are now walking around with proof of citizenship and ID. So these are just some of the impacts that we're seeing because of these enforcement policies. And we'd like to give you a couple of ideas of some of the things that you as attorneys or you as community members can do to help restore due process into the system to try to reduce and mitigate at least the impact of this type of mass deportation enforcement. Luvia, I don't know if you have some thoughts, and I can add a few.
Sure. Yeah. So as each of you are thinking about what you could do, as each of you are thinking about what role you could play, there are many. We here in Illinois have a very robust network that we've developed over the years called rapid response teams. We have, from what I know, about 30 teams throughout the state. And it's not unique to us in Illinois. So no matter where you are, that you're listening or you're watching this recording, know that more than likely some immigrant rights organization or somebody probably has developed some type of rapid response teams. We don't have time to go into the details of what these teams do, but just know that there are opportunities for you to be anything from interpretation, an interpreter if you speak another language. And it doesn't have to be only Spanish, it could be other languages. We have a hotline here in Illinois that operates in 5 different languages. So just know it could be anything from that. It could be anything from making sure that if somebody is, for example, has some type of court, going with them to court. We've seen how people go for the regular check-ins and end up getting deported despite having some type of status. So that could be another option. It could also be, depending on where you live and what organizations are available, helping people through the process sometimes. Unfortunately, there's not enough attorneys, and as we all know, when a person has to go to immigration court, they are not assigned an attorney, unlike for other different things. And many people cannot afford them. I know I've seen in the last few weeks, I don't know how many GoFundMe accounts being created for individuals that are in now deportation proceedings and cannot afford hiring an attorney. I'm not suggesting each of you volunteer because we know that that's many hours, but at least initial guidance, because many people do not even know, depending on how they were detained, they may be now eligible for some kind of relief. So it could be simply just screening an individual and then guiding them to an attorney that assuming they could hire. So I think from my standpoint, I just wanted to say that there are many different type of volunteer opportunities or many different ways that you could get involved. As Stacy mentioned, this is impacting our communities in every single way. I wanted to add an example of the racial profiling that is happening here at the airport at O'Hare, which, as many of you may know, is one of the busiest airports across the country. There is a place where all the Lyft, Uber drivers have to go to wait for clients. They're being racially profiled. All of these Uber drivers, Lyft drivers have a valid driver's license, have insurance, and every single day there's at least 5 to 10 being detained and now being somewhere in the country despite having some kind of status, and again, despite having a driver's license. And they're being chosen based on how they look and based on their ability to speak English in a certain way. So there are more and more people that just need some type of legal assistance. So I want to just emphasize the importance of being able to provide some sort of that, given your each of you that are listening, your area of expertise. Thank you.
Just a couple of other opportunities to add. The opportunity to represent individuals who are in detention. And even if immigration is not your area of expertise, there are organizations such as the Immigration Justice Campaign, where they provide mentors and interpreters, and there are specific pieces of cases that you can do. The ability of individuals in detention to secure bond or release on humanitarian grounds has basically been eliminated under the current administration, but there's still a need for a representation to try to use those existing laws, but also for those who have experience in federal court. There are now several projects around the country where lawyers are volunteering to file habeas cases in federal court, because that is really the only current way that individuals are being released from the overcrowded conditions in detention. There's opportunities through the ABA to represent non-detained individuals. There's a huge backlog of cases right now in the immigration system, and there's a particular need for representation of children. And so the ABA's South Texas Pro Bono Asylum Representation Project, ProBar, and the Immigration Justice Project, IGP, are always mentoring volunteers. There are court observation programs, which is a way to enhance accountability of what is happening in immigration court. And the ABA has such a program for volunteers that you can find on the Commission on Immigration website. And just to give one example of non-immigration related legal help that's needed, those who do family law, for example, are desperately needed to be helping families draft powers of attorney for custody and for financial matters, so that if they are arrested and detained, there are written plans about who will take care of their children and their finances while they're detained and if they're deported. And then finally, opportunities to educate and advocate with policymakers and legislators at local, state, federal level. And there are lots of initiatives, including the one that Luvia works with, that are looking for more community support. So hopefully that gives you some ideas of ways in which you can participate in trying to reduce these devastating impacts of mass deportation policy. And we thank you for your interest.
Thank you.